The gunshot came first, cracking off the red rock above Paloma Springs like a rifle shot flung from the mountain itself, and then came the horse, lathered white at the neck, stumbling down the wagon road with a man barely holding to its mane. Frances Atwood dropped the harness she had been mending and ran into the yard just as the horse went down on its knees in front of the stage depot, spilling Tomas Reyes into the dust. Tomas. She was at his side before the dust settled, her hands already finding the wet, dark stain spreading across his shoulder. 17 years old, the boy had ridden for her father since before he could grow a mustache, and now his face had gone the color of ash. Señorita Frances. His voice came out thin, stretched over pain. Riders, coming from the Shenega Road, 6, maybe 8. They mean to take the letter, the one your father. His eyes rolled and his words dissolved into a cough that brought blood to his lips. What letter, Tomas, what letter? She shook his good shoulder gently, desperate. But his eyes had already gone unfocused, staring past her at the yellowing cottonwoods along the creek, at the aspen gold climbing the shoulders of the Santa Ritas, at a sky so blue and clean it seemed impossible that anything evil could be riding beneath it. Hank Dawson came out of the barn at a limping run, his gray mustache white with hay dust, a shotgun already broken open over his forearm. What in thunder? Riders coming, Hank. Tomas says they want a letter, he didn't say which one. Frances pressed her apron hard against the wound. Get him inside. Get the Winchester down from over the door and the shotgun shells from the tin on the shelf. Frances, there's a stage due in from Tucson inside the hour. Amos is driving it. She looked up the road, toward the pass, and saw what she had been afraid to see. A low smear of dust rising above the chaparral, moving fast, moving toward them. Her father had built this line stone by stone, relay by relay, from Tucson down through the golden autumn hills to the border town of Calabasas, trading fair prices with Sonoran freighters and Tohono O'odham families who knew every dry wash and hidden spring between here and the international line. 7 months since a flash flood had rolled his coach in the Shenega Wash and taken him from her, and in that time she had held the whole enterprise together with her own 2 hands, her father's ledgers and Hank Dawson's aching knees. She had buried her grief in timetables and harness leather because there had been no one else to do it. She was not about to let it be burned to the ground for a letter she had never even seen. Get him inside, she said again, steadier now. And Hank, load the shotgun. Whatever's coming, we're not running. Hank looked at her for one long moment, the way he had when she was 6 years old and had told him she meant to learn to drive the 6-up team herself, and then he nodded and gathered Tomas up in his arms like the boy weighed nothing at all. The dust cloud on the Shenega Road grew closer, and beneath it, faint but growing, came the rattle of wheels and the blowing of tired horses. The Tucson stage was coming down the last grade into Paloma Springs at the worst possible moment, running straight toward whatever was riding hard behind that dust. Frances stood in the yard with her father's rifle in her hands and waited to see which would arrive first, the stagecoach or the men who wanted to burn it. The coach came first, careening around the last bend with Amos Whitfield standing in the box hauling on the brake, the 6-horse team blowing hard and wide-eyed. It rocked to a stop in front of the depot in a boil of dust, and Frances was already moving toward it, rifle low but ready. Amos, get your passengers down and inside now. There's trouble on the road behind you. Amos, a heavy-set man who had driven this line for 11 years and startled at very little, went pale beneath his sunburn. Miss Atwood, we saw riders bunched up back at the crossing. Didn't think nothing of it. The door of the coach swung open before he finished, and a man stepped down into the yard with the unhurried economy of someone who had climbed down from a great many stagecoaches in a great many dangerous places. He was perhaps 30, dust-colored hat pulled low, a canvas coat that had seen better winters, and eyes the gray-green of sage after rain, eyes that went first not to Frances but to the road, measuring the dust cloud, counting the riders in it before anyone had told him there was anything to count. "How many rifles do you have in that depot, ma'am?" he asked, in a voice low and even, as if he were asking about the weather. "2 shotguns, 1 rifle, and a revolver that hasn't been fired since my father died," Francis said, because there did not seem to be time for anything but the truth. "That'll do to start." He reached back into the coach and pulled out a battered carpet bag, and from inside it, with no more drama than a man drawing out a pocket watch, he produced a well-oiled Colt Peacemaker and checked its cylinder with a practiced snap of his wrist. "Sir, the stage is bound for Calabasas. You're a paying passenger, not a. Name's Wesley Blackwell." He said it plainly, the way a man says a name he has said many times and still, somehow, has to remind himself is his own. "And I've decided Calabasas can wait." Behind them, an older woman and a drummer in a checked suit were scrambling down from the coach and running for the depot door, and the dust cloud on the road had resolved itself into 8 riders coming on hard, hats low, rifles already free of their scabbards. "Mr. Blackwell, you don't know what you're stepping into." "No, ma'am, I don't." He was already moving toward the corner of the depot's low stone wall, finding cover with the same unhurried competence he'd shown drawing his revolver. "But I know what a man riding 8 strong toward one woman and an old hand looks like, and I've never much cared for the answer." There was no more time to argue. The riders came around the bend at a gallop, and the first shot cracked out from among them, splintering the depot's porch post 6 inches from Hank Dawson's head. Frances dropped behind the water trough and brought the rifle up, the way her father had taught her on quail and jackrabbits a lifetime ago, and fired a shot she meant only to be heard, aimed high and wide over the lead rider's hat. "This is Atwood land," she shouted, her voice cracking across the yard louder than she believed herself capable of. "Turn around." The answer was another volley, and this time Wesley Blackwell returned fire. 2 shots, unhurried, and a horse screamed and wheeled out of the charge riderless while its rider rolled into the chaparral cursing. Hank's shotgun boomed from the porch, scattering shot wide across the road, more warning than wound, and the charge broke apart into confusion, riders reining hard, shouting to one another. A big man on a black horse, a red bandana pulled up over the lower half of his face, hauled his mount around at the edge of the yard, close enough that Francis could see pale eyes over the cloth. "This ain't finished, Atwood," he called, in a voice like gravel dragged over tin. "Ben sends his regards." Then he wheeled and was gone, his riders streaming after him back up the Shenega road, leaving only dust and the smell of burnt powder and one riderless horse trotting nervous circles in the yard. Frances stood up slowly from behind the trough, her knees unsteady, her ears ringing. Wesley Blackwell rose from behind the stone wall and thumbed fresh cartridges into his revolver without looking at her, the way a man reloads out of habit rather than fear, though his jaw was tight. "Corbin," she said, half to herself, the name landing like a stone in her stomach. "Silas Corbin. Someone you know?" Wesley asked. "My father's oldest friend in the territory." She looked down the empty road, at the settling dust, at the golden cottonwood leaves drifting down onto the yard as though nothing at all had happened. "And the man my father named to help settle his affairs, should anything happen to him." Wesley Blackwell looked at her for a long moment, and something moved behind those sage-colored eyes, something that looked almost like recognition, as if he understood better than most men the particular ugliness of a trusted man turned wolf. "Then I reckon Calabasas can wait a good while longer," he said, and holstered his gun. Inside the depot, by lamplight, Hank laid Tomas out on the horsehair settee, and Francis worked to clean and bind the wound in his shoulder, while the boy drifted in and out of a fevered half-sleep. The bullet had passed clean through, high enough to miss the lung, and Hank pronounced him lucky in the flat voice of a man who had seen luck run out too many times to trust it easily. Wesley Blackwell stood near the door with his hat off, watching the road, and it was there that Francis first really looked at him, not as a stranger who happened to be passing through, but as a man who had, for reasons she did not yet understand, chosen to stay. "You didn't have to do that," she said, tying off the bandage. "No, ma'am. Most passengers would have stayed flat on the floor of that coach and thanked God when it was over. Most passengers didn't spend years learning that flat on the floor gets you killed just the same, only slower. He said it without self-pity, a simple fact offered up like the time of day. Besides, I don't much care for men who ride 8 against 2. She studied him a moment longer, the lean, sun-browned face, the careful way he held himself, like a man accustomed to being watched and judged and found wanting. "Well, Mr. Blackwell, it seems you've missed your stage to Calabasas." "Seems I have." The corner of his mouth moved, not quite a smile. "I don't suppose the Atwood line has need of an extra pair of hands, at least until your friend Mr. Corbin's business is settled." Francis looked down at Tomas, at his bandaged shoulder rising and falling with each shallow breath, and thought of the 8 riders and the man with pale eyes who had called her father's oldest friend by name as though invoking him were a threat all its own. "I imagine it does," she said. That night, once Tomas had been settled into a real bed, and Hank had ridden the perimeter twice to be certain the riders had truly gone, Frances sat at her father's roll-top desk in the depot office with a lamp burning low, and told Wesley Blackwell everything, because there was no longer any sense in keeping it to herself. Her father, Elias Atwood, had come west from Missouri in 1858, worked freight lines out of Santa Fe, and by 1868 had built this stretch of road himself, station by relay station, earning the trust of Sonoran traders who crossed the border with hides and silver, and of the Tohono O'odham families whose knowledge of water and weather had saved his life more than once. He had built a home here in Paloma Springs, married Francis's mother who had died when Francis was 10, and raised his daughter to know every mile of the line, every horse in the remuda, every figure in the ledger. "He always said a stage line is nothing but promises kept on a schedule," Francis said. "Get the mail through, get the passengers through, do it in weather that would make a sane man turn back. That was his whole religion." 7 months ago, driving the mail run himself through a sudden autumn cloudburst. His coach had gone into the flooded Chenega wash and rolled, and he had drowned before Hank and the others could reach him. "And Silas Corbin?" Wesley asked, his voice gentle in a way that surprised her. "A Tucson banker, my father's friend for 20 years. Father named him in his will to help settle the estate if anything happened, because Corbin knew the finances of the line and father trusted him." Her hands, folded on the desk, tightened until the knuckles went pale. 3 months after the funeral, Corbin filed papers with the territorial court claiming I am not fit to inherit or manage the line. Claims I've shown signs of, in his words, nervous instability since my father's death. Claims a woman alone cannot properly run a stage and freight operation and ought to have a guardian appointed over the estate. Him, of course. "That's a lie." "Of course it's a lie." Her voice shook, not with sorrow now but with a cold, banked fury she had been carrying for months. "But he is a respected man in Tucson, and I am a woman who inherited a stage line, and there are judges who will believe the former over the latter without much persuading. Circuit Court sits again in 3 weeks. If I cannot prove the petition false before then, Corbin will be granted guardianship of the estate, and everything my father built will belong to him in all but name." And tonight, 8 riders came to burn a letter. Wesley leaned forward, forearms on his knees. "You said your father named Corbin to help settle his affairs if anything happened. Sounds like maybe your father had second thoughts." Tomas said the same before he passed out. "A letter." She pressed her fingers to her eyes. "I don't know what it says, or where it is, or if it even still exists. I only know that Silas Corbin is frightened enough of it to send armed men to kill for it." Wesley Blackwell sat quiet a moment, watching the lamp flame gutter in the draft from the window, and Frances found herself watching him in turn, wondering what exactly had made a stranger step down from a stagecoach into gunfire for people he had known less than an hour. "I'll help you find it," he said finally. "The letter and whatever else you need to bring this Corbin down." "Why?" She did not ask it unkindly, only honestly. "You don't know me, Mr. Blackwell. You don't owe the Atwood line anything." He was quiet long enough that she thought he might not answer at all. When he did, his voice had gone low and careful, the voice of a man choosing each word as though it cost him something. "Because I've spent a good many years being the kind of man who rides past trouble he could have stopped, ma'am, and told himself it wasn't his business." He turned his hat over in his hands. "I'm trying real hard these days to be a different kind of man." Seems like tonight was as good a place to start as any. She did not press him further, though she filed the words away, sensing there was a great deal more behind them than he had said. Outside, the wind had shifted, and through the window she could see the aspen gold on the mountain shoulders trembling under a sky gone suddenly restless, high clouds moving fast from the northwest though the day had dawned so brilliantly clear. "Storm coming," Hank said from the doorway, following her gaze. "Early for it. Weather's been strange all week." "Then we'd best move quickly," Francis said, and did not yet know how right she was. They rode out for Calabasas 3 days later, once Tomas was strong enough to be left in the care of the depot cook, Senora Delgado, and once Hank had satisfied himself no more riders were lurking on the Chenega road. Frances drove the light spring wagon herself, with Wesley beside her on the bench and 2 saddle horses trailing behind on lead ropes, and for the first several miles neither of them spoke much, the easy silence of 2 people learning the shape of each other's company. The country between Paloma Springs and the border town unrolled in a blaze of autumn color, unlike anything Frances had ever quite noticed before, though she had driven this road 100 times. Cottonwoods burning gold along every wash, the sycamores turning bronze, the high peaks of the Santa Ritas already dusted faintly white at their crowns, though the valley floor still lay warm and drowsy in October sun. "It's beautiful country," Wesley said at last, watching a hawk turn slow circles against that impossible blue sky. "Never seen anything quite like it." "Where are you from, Mr. Blackwell?" "Texas, originally, then Kansas a while, then a good many places I'd rather not name." He said it lightly, but she heard the door close behind the words and did not push it open. "You said you were headed for Calabasas before all this, mining claim, something like that. Man I used to ride with years back staked a claim in the hills south of there, silver mostly, wrote to say there was work if I wanted honest labor for a change." He glanced sideways at her, something wry in his expression. "Guess he'll have to make do without me a while longer. You could still go. Once we've found what we need in Calabasas." "I could." He was quiet a moment, watching the road. "I find I'm not in as much of a hurry as I was a few days back." She felt the warmth of that admission more than she wanted to, and busied herself with the reins to hide it, though she suspected, from the small curve at the corner of his mouth, that he had noticed anyway. Calabasas sat on a low bench above the Santa Cruz River, a scatter of adobe buildings around the old customs house, a place where 3 flags had flown at one time or another, and where the language on the street shifted from English to Spanish, to the soft rounded vowels of the Tohono O'odham traders without anyone remarking on it. Doña Elena Ortega ran the trading post and way station at the edge of town, a stout, sharp-eyed widow who had known Elias Atwood for 15 years, and she embraced Frances hard the moment she stepped down from the wagon. "Frances, mija, I heard about the trouble at Paloma Springs. Tomas Reyes, is he? He'll live, Doña Elena, thank God. We came because of the letter." Something shuddered behind the older woman's dark eyes, and she glanced quickly past Frances at the street before drawing them both inside the cool, dim trading post, thick with the smell of leather and dried chilies and coffee. "Your father came to me in the spring before he died," Elena said, once the door was barred behind them. "He was troubled. He said Silas Corbin had come to him wanting to be named sole executor of the estate, with full power over the line and the land, and your father refused him outright. He said Corbin's face went strange when he refused, strange and cold, and it frightened him enough that he wrote everything down, the whole conversation, and asked me to keep it safe, along with a letter stating plainly that you and you alone were to inherit everything with no guardian needed or wanted. Do you have it? Francis asked, hardly daring to breathe. Alina's face crumpled with genuine grief. I did, Mija. 3 weeks ago, a man came through, said he was a lawyer sent by the court to collect documents relevant to your father's estate. I did not think to question it, may God forgive me. He took the letter. Description: Wesley asked, quiet but sharp. Big man, pale eyes, a scar through one eyebrow, red bandana around his neck, though he wore no mask that day. Rourke, Francis breathed. But Mija, I am not a foolish old woman. Alina managed a thin, fierce smile. I read that letter perhaps 20 times before it was ever taken, sitting up nights praying over what it meant for you. I remember every word. And 2 days after your father wrote it, he went before the notary in Tucson, a Mr. Whitcomb, and had a fair copy witnessed and recorded in case anything should happen to the original. I remember him telling me so quite clearly. If it still exists, it will be in the court's own recording book, filed under his name. Hope, sharp and sudden, rose in Francis's chest. Then Corbin doesn't know that copy exists. If Rourke merely stole what he was sent to steal, and did not think to ask an old woman what else she might know, Wesley said, then no, he does not. Doña Alina took Francis's hands in both of hers, weathered and strong. Write down everything I have told you, and I will sign it before witnesses. It is not the letter itself, but it is a woman's sworn word against a thief's silence, and I have lived long enough on this border to know that sometimes that is enough. They left Calabasas the next morning with Alina's signed affidavit folded carefully into Francis's saddlebag, and turned the wagon north toward Tucson, 60 long miles up the valley, to find the notary Whitcomb and the recorded copy of a letter that might yet save everything her father had built. The road to Tucson took them 2 full days, with a night spent at a way station run by a Tohono O'odham family the Atwood line had done business with for a decade. Louis Manuel, an elder with a face seemed like dry riverbed clay and eyes that missed nothing, greeted Francis with the easy warmth of long acquaintance, and listened without interrupting as she explained what had happened. Your father was a fair man, Louis Manuel said at last, in the unhurried cadence of someone accustomed to choosing words with care. He paid honest prices for our hay and our knowledge of the water, and he never once tried to cheat us the way some Anglos do. My grandson Ramon watched 3 riders pass this way 2 weeks ago before dawn, moving fast toward Calabasas. Big man on a black horse, red cloth at his neck, 2 others. Rourke, Wesley said again, and Francis heard the flat certainty of a man building a case in his mind piece by piece. If you have need of hands who know this country, Louis Manuel said, my grandson and his cousins would ride for the daughter of Elias Atwood. Send word when the time comes. Francis thanked him with more feeling than words could properly hold, and that night, sitting outside beneath a sky blazing with more stars than she had ever thought a single sky could contain, she found herself talking to Wesley Blackwell in a way she had not talked to anyone since her father died. You handle a rifle like a man who's had to, she said, watching the firelight move across his face. I have. Soldier. No. He was quiet a long moment, poking at the fire with a stick, and when he spoke again his voice had gone careful in that way she was learning meant. He stood at the edge of something he did not often say aloud. I rode with men who took things that weren't theirs, Miss Atwood. Years back in Kansas and the Indian Territory. Held up a stage once near Silver City. Nobody was killed, but a shotgun guard took a bullet in the leg that near ended him, and it was the sound he made, going down, that woke something up in me I'd been asleep to for a long while. Francis sat very still, watching him, not with fear but with something closer to recognition, as though a puzzle piece she had not known was missing had quietly slid into place. I left that night, he went on, changed my name. Blackwell was my mother's family name before she married. I've been trying, these 3 years since, to be a man worth the name I chose for myself instead of the one I was born to. He looked up at her finally, and there was real fear in his face, the fear of a man who has just handed someone a weapon and does not know if they will use it. I understand if that changes things. If you'd rather I rode on to Calabasas after all. Francis thought of 8 riders and a man who had stepped down from a stagecoach into gunfire for strangers, of a gentle hand on a spooked horse's neck, of careful words offered honestly even when the truth cost him. My father used to say a man is what he does today, Mr. Blackwell, not what he did yesterday. She reached across the small distance between them and laid her hand over his, where it rested on his knee. You rode into trouble to help me when you had every reason to keep riding. I know what that's worth better than most. He turned his hand beneath hers, so their fingers laced together, and neither of them said anything more for a long while, content to sit together beneath that enormous sky while the fire burned low. Tucson in October smelled of dust and roasting chilies, and the particular bustle of a territorial town that had grown fast and rough around the old Presidio walls. Mr. Whitcomb, the notary, turned out to be a thin, nervous man with ink-stained fingers who went pale when Francis explained her business. Miss Atwood, I must tell you, I have been uneasy about your father's estate for some months. He led them into a cramped back office lined with document boxes and lowered his voice as though the walls themselves might carry word to Silas Corbin. Your father did indeed have a letter recorded here in April stating his wishes plainly. I filed it myself. But when Mr. Corbin's petition for guardianship came before the court, that letter was mysteriously absent from the file, and in its place was a physician's affidavit I had never seen before, attesting to your, nervous instability. A doctor's statement. What doctor? A Dr. Amos Fielding of Tucson. Whitcomb's mouth twisted with distaste. I made inquiries discreetly, and Miss Atwood, I do not believe Dr. Fielding has ever examined you at all. I believe the man does not even keep proper patient records for the date in question. Then it's forged, Wesley said. I believe so, though I cannot prove it without more courage than I confess I possess alone. Whitcomb's hands trembled slightly as he pulled a ledger from the shelf. I did, however, keep my own private notation of your father's original letter in my own filing register, dated the day he brought it in. It is not the letter itself, but it establishes beyond doubt that such a letter existed, was recorded, and has since vanished from the court's file. Together with Mrs. Ortega's affidavit, and if you could persuade Dr. Fielding to admit the truth of his false statement, I believe you would have enough to bring before Judge Price when court convenes. Would you testify to what you've told us? Francis asked, publicly. Whitcomb swallowed hard, glancing again toward the window, toward the street where Silas Corbin's bank stood not 4 blocks distant. Silas Corbin is a powerful man in this territory, Miss Atwood, but your father was kind to me once, when I was a young man newly arrived with nothing to my name, and gave me work when no one else would. I owe him a debt I have let go unpaid for too long. He straightened his narrow shoulders. Yes, I will testify. They left Whitcomb's office with the notation copied carefully into Francis's own hand and witnessed by the notary himself, one solid piece of a case slowly building itself out of scattered fragments, and it was there on the boardwalk outside that their luck turned. Wesley Colton. The voice came flat and hard from across the street, and Francis felt Wesley go rigid beside her before she even turned to see the speaker. A lean man in a duster coat, unshaven, a bad-shaped scar of old sun damage where a lawman's star had once hung on his vest, though he wore no star now. Dutch Mayor, Wesley said, very quietly. It's been a long time. Been hearing your name whispered around a card table in Silver City not 2 months back. Wanted, dead or alive, for the Shenega stage job, 5 years running now. Bounty's gone up twice since. Mayor's hand hovered near his hip, not drawing yet but ready. Didn't figure to find you standing on a Tucson street big as life, wearing another man's name like a Sunday coat. Francis felt cold fear settle in her stomach, not for herself but for the man beside her, whose whole careful new life had just cracked open in front of a stranger's eyes. "Walk away, Dutch," Wesley said. "I've got no quarrel with you and no interest in reliving old business. Bounty don't care what you're interested in." Mayor's smile showed teeth gone brown with tobacco. 10 years, they'd hang you outright. These days, territory's gotten soft, might be you'd only do prison time. Either way, that reward's mine the moment I decide to collect it. He glanced at Francis, something calculating in his eyes. "Course, I could be persuaded to forget I ever saw you for the right consideration. Man's got to eat." "I don't carry that kind of money," Francis said before Wesley could answer. "Didn't figure you did." Mayor's gaze slid back to Wesley. "Meet me tonight, Colton. Livery stable at the end of Mayor Street, 10 o'clock. We'll talk terms, just the two of us, old time's sake. You don't show, I'll have a deputy marshal's ear by morning, and every stage guard on this road half hoping to make a name shooting you out of the saddle." He touched his hat brim to Francis with mocking courtesy and walked away down the dusty street, leaving Wesley standing very still, his face gone pale beneath its sun-browned color. "You can't go," Francis said. "It's a trap. He means to hold you until other men arrive, collect the bounty whole, maybe kill you before it ever comes to a lawman's ear at all." "I know it," Wesley's jaw was tight. "But if I don't go, he tells every marshal and bounty man in the territory where to find me, and then it isn't only my trouble, it's yours too, Francis. You can't afford to have your one ally arrested for old crimes in the middle of exposing Corbin's new ones." It was the first time he had used her given name, and even amid the fear, she felt it land somewhere warm. "Then we go together," she said, "but not through the front door." That night, 10 o'clock found Wesley Blackwell walking alone down Mayor Street toward the livery stable, hat low, hands loose at his sides, doing his best impression of a man walking calmly into a trap he had already resigned himself to. What Dutch Mayor did not know was that Frances Atwood had circled 2 streets over an hour earlier and let herself in through the loose board at the rear of the livery that every stage driver in Tucson knew about, because livery stables were built the same way in every town in the territory, and she had grown up around them. Inside, in the dark and the smell of hay and horse sweat, she found Mayor and 2 other men waiting in the lamplight near the center aisle, rifles resting easy across their forearms, clearly meaning this meeting to end with Wesley Blackwell either dead or bound. She had brought no gun. She had brought instead her father's old bullwhip, coiled at her hip, the one he had taught her to use on cattle drives when she was 14, and too proud to admit she wanted to learn only because the other drovers said a girl couldn't manage it. Wesley stepped through the front door into lamplight, and Mayor's men leveled their rifles at once. "Real simple, Colton," Mayor said. "You come quiet, we ride to Silver City, I collect what's mine, and maybe, if you're lucky, the marshal there remembers you never killed a man in your life and goes easy. And if I don't come quiet, then you don't come at all and I collect the dead version instead, pays a little less. I'll manage." In the shadows of the loft above, Francis uncoiled the whip with a whisper of leather, and, aiming not at any man but at the lantern hanging from the center beam, snapped it forward with all the strength in her arm. The lantern shattered, plunging half the stable into darkness and sending burning oil skittering across the straw-strewn floor in a sudden crackling flare that made every horse in the building scream and rear against its stall gate. In the chaos, Wesley moved. He drove his shoulder into the nearest gunman before the man could find his footing in the sudden dark, sent the rifle spinning away into a stall, and came up with his own revolver drawn just as Mayor, cursing, tried to bring his own weapon to bear on the noise in the loft. "Mayor!" Francis shouted from above, and when he turned to find the voice, she cracked the whip again, this time low across his gun hand, and the revolver clattered to the straw as he yelped and clutched his fingers. The third man had already bolted for the door, more concerned with the spreading fire than with any bounty, and Wesley kicked Mayor's fallen revolver away into the dark before the man could scramble after it. "Get out," Wesley said, gun leveled steady despite the flickering firelight and the panicked horses. Get out Dutch, and if you ever say my name in a town where I'm standing again, I promise you it'll be the last name you ever speak." Mayer, cradling his stinging hand, looked from Wesley to the shadow above in the loft, and something like grudging respect moved through his scowl. "Didn't figure you for a man who'd let a woman fight his battles." "I don't," Wesley said. "I'm real fortunate to be loved by one who fights her own." Mayer spat, gathered his dignity along with his hat, and disappeared into the smoke-hazed dark. And by the time the stable owner and two neighbors arrived with water buckets, the small fire was already stamped out, and there was no one left to explain it to but a coughing, wide-eyed liveryman who accepted Wesley's story of a dropped lantern without much question. They walked back to the boarding house where Francis had taken a room, neither speaking until they were alone beneath the cottonwoods lining the acequia behind the building, the night sky wheeling bright and cold above them. "You could have been killed," Wesley said, finally, his voice rough. "Walking into a livery full of armed men with nothing but a bullwhip. You could have been killed walking into it with nothing but your own 2 hands and a fool's notion of doing it alone." She reached up and touched his jaw, where a bruise was already darkening from the shoulder he had taken from Mayer's man. "You saved my life at Paloma Springs without being asked, Wesley Blackwell. I wasn't about to let you face that alone and call it even." He caught her hand against his face and held it there, and in the moonlight she saw something break open in his expression, some old, guarded thing finally letting go. "My name was Wesley Colton," he said quietly, "before. I never killed anyone, Francis. I swear that to you on my mother's grave, but I rode with men who did worse than steal, and I was young enough and lost enough to tell myself it wasn't my business what happened once the guns came out. That boy who took a bullet in Silver City still walks with a limp, last I heard. I carry that. I'll carry it the rest of my life. And what have you done with the years since? Worked honest jobs from Kansas to here. Sent money when I had it to the guard's family, anonymous, through a lawyer who never asked questions. Tried, every single day, to be a man my mother wouldn't be ashamed to claim." His voice cracked on the last words. "I never told anyone the whole truth before tonight, not one living soul. Then I'm glad you told me." Francis stepped closer, close enough to feel the warmth of him against the cool night air. "Whatever name you were born to, Wesley Blackwell is the man standing in front of me now, and he is the finest man I have met since my father died. I don't intend to lose him to some bounty hunter's greed, or to his own shame, either one." He looked down at her for a long moment, searching her face as though he could not quite believe what he found there. And then, slowly, giving her every chance to step back, he lowered his head and kissed her. It was not the desperate kiss of danger past, though there was relief in it. It was slow and careful and full of a tenderness that made her chest ache with everything she had been holding since her father's death, everything she had told herself she had no time to feel. When he drew back, his forehead rested against hers, and neither of them moved to break the closeness for a long while. "I meant to only pass through," he murmured. "Calabasas, then wherever the wind carried me after. And now I find I've got no interest in being anywhere the wind carries me, if it isn't somewhere near you." They returned to Paloma Springs 3 days later with Whitcomb's notation, Elena Ortega's affidavit, and a plan half formed between them, only to find Hank Dawson waiting in the yard with a face like a thundercloud and a telegram in his hand. "Ryder came through from Tucson this morning," Hank said, thrusting the paper at Francis. "Dr. Fielding's office got broken into 2 nights back. Whoever done it took every one of his patient ledgers. And word's going round town that Corbin's been asking after a woman and a stranger poking about the courthouse records." Francis's stomach dropped. He knows we're building a case against him. Worse than that, Hank's weathered face was grim. Tomas is well enough to talk plain now, and he remembered something more, riding in here half dead with fever the way he was. Man leading that raid, the one called Rourke, he said something to another rider before Tomas took his bullet and fell. Said, "Once we've got the letter and quieted the girl, the boss wants the ranch itself burned to bedrock so there's nothing left to argue over in court." No ranch, no line, no argument. Just Corbin holding a burned-over claim and a guardianship paper nobody's left to contest. Wesley's hand found Francis's shoulder, steady and warm. Then he means to finish what he started at the depot, and soon, before the circuit judge arrives. Circuit court convenes in 9 days, Francis said, her mind already racing ahead. If Corbin means to strike before then, it will be soon. Within the week, I'd guess, while he still believes we haven't enough evidence to matter. Then we'd best make certain that when he comes, Wesley said, he finds more waiting for him than he bargained for. Francis looked at the depot behind them, at the corrals and the barn and the low adobe house where she had been born, all of it gilded gold in the late afternoon light, the mountains behind it wearing their first true dusting of snow along the highest ridges. Early, the way Hank had warned. Beauty and danger sitting side by side, the way they so often did in this country. Then we don't wait for him to choose the ground, she said. We choose it for him. Word went out that evening by rider in every direction Francis could think to send it. Ramon Manuel and 2 cousins came from the Wadem settlement within a day, quiet young men who knew the arroyos and rock outcrops around Paloma Springs better than any map could show. Doña Elena Ortega could not come herself but sent her nephew, a steady young vaquero named Miguel, who had ridden dispatch for the Mexican army and knew how to hold a line under fire without losing his head. Even the Paloma Springs blacksmith, a broad, quiet Swede named Lars Eriksson, brought his own shotgun and his considerable strength to the gathering in the depot's main room, where Francis spread a hand-drawn map of the ranch buildings across the table by lamplight. We don't have the numbers to meet Corbin's men rifle for rifle if he brings as many as he did the first time, maybe more, Wesley said, tracing the map with one finger. So we don't let them see how many of us there truly are. We make them count wrong. Over the 2 days that followed, they built a battlefield out of shadows and misdirection. Lanterns were rigged on ropes strung between the barn and the bunkhouse, so that from a distance in darkness, they could be hauled back and forth to look like men moving between posts. Old coats and hats, stuffed with straw, were propped along the corral fence to double as sentries in poor light. The remuda of spare stage horses was moved into the largest corral nearest the road, penned behind a gate rigged with a slipknot that Hank could release with one sharp pull of a rope from the porch, ready to stampede outward into any riders who came too close. Ramon Manuel and his cousins scouted the approaches each dawn and dusk, and on the 4th evening, Ramon came riding in hard with word that a large party of horsemen, perhaps 15 strong, had made camp 6 miles up the Chenega Road, clearly waiting for full dark to move. Tonight, then, Wesley said, and Francis felt her heart climb into her throat, not with fear alone but with something fierce and ready, the same steadiness she remembered feeling as a girl the first time her father let her take the reins of a 6-horse team alone. Everyone to their places, she said, and remember what we agreed. We take work alive if it's within our power. A dead hired gun tells Judge Price nothing. A living one who fears the noose more than he fears Silas Corbin might tell us everything. Night fell early and cold. The sky scrubbed clear of the storm clouds that had threatened all week, though the mountain peaks beyond glowed faintly white under a rising moon, snow lying deeper up there than it had any right to so early in the season. Francis took her position on the depot porch roof with her father's rifle. Wesley crouched near the corral gate with Hank, and Lars Eriksson and Miguel waited in the shadow of the barn, while Ramon and his cousins circled wide on horseback to come at the raiders from behind, unseen. They heard the riders before they saw them, the low creak of saddle leather and the muffled thud of many hooves moving with deliberate quiet along the road. Cole Rourke rode at the front, red bandana pulled up over his face again, pale eyes catching the moonlight as he raised a hand to halt his men at the edge of the yard, studying the lanterns swinging their slow, deceptive rhythm between barn and bunkhouse, the straw-stuffed sentries standing their silent watch along the fence. "Looks like more of them than we figured," one rider muttered. Corbin said the girl's alone, but for an old man and a boy, Rourke growled. Don't lose your nerve over shadows and lamp tricks. But he hesitated all the same, and it was in that hesitation that Frances, from her place on the roof, fired her first shot, deliberately high, shattering the porch lantern near the corral gate in a burst of sparks that sent the whole scene into confused, flickering darkness. Hank pulled his rope. The corral gate swung wide, and the remuda of spare horses burst out in a thundering, wild-eyed stampede straight into the mass of raiders, scattering their formation instantly, horses screaming and wheeling and rearing as their riders fought for control amid the chaos. Lars Eriksson stepped out from the barn's shadow and fired his shotgun into the air, the boom rolling off the mountainside like cannon fire. And from the darkness behind the raiders came the sudden sharp cries of Ramon Manuel and his cousins, driving their own mounts hard into the rear of the confused column, cutting off any clean retreat back up the road. In the churning dark and dust, Wesley moved straight for Rourke, who had been thrown clear of his rearing horse and was scrambling up with his revolver drawn, and the two men collided in the shadow of the barn wall in a brief, brutal struggle, Wesley driving Rourke's gun hand hard against the timber until the weapon fell, then dropping him with a single hard blow that put the bigger man on his back in the dirt, dazed and gasping. "Stay down," Wesley said, breathing hard, his own revolver leveled at Rourke's chest. "Give me a reason not to, and I'll gladly take it, but I'd rather see you hang honest than shoot you quick." Around them, the raid was already collapsing into disorder. 2 riders had been thrown and captured by Miguel, disarmed and bound before they could regain their feet. 3 more, seeing the stampeding horses and hearing gunfire from what seemed like every direction at once, wheeled their mounts and fled back up the Shenega road at a dead run, unwilling to fight an enemy they could not properly count. Ramon's cousins herded 4 more into a tight, frightened knot near the wash, hands raised, rifles surrendered into the dust. By the time the moon had climbed another hand's width into the sky, it was over, with no man dead on either side, though 2 of Corbin's hired riders nursed broken arms from falls, and Rourke sat bound and scowling against a fence post while Frances knelt in front of him, her father's rifle resting easy across her knees. "You've got a choice to make, Mr. Rourke," she said, her voice steady though her hands still trembled faintly with the aftermath of the fight. "Silas Corbin sent you to steal a letter, burn a ranch, and if you'll be honest, likely to kill me if it came to it. He's a banker sitting warm in Tucson while you sit here in the dirt with a rope waiting for you in a territorial court. I imagine he never once mentioned that part of the arrangement." Rourke's jaw worked, pale eyes flicking from Frances to Wesley to the ring of grim, armed faces surrounding him, and something in his bravado finally cracked. "He's got that letter," Rourke said at last, sullenly. "Your father's letter. Kept it himself, locked in his own desk. Didn't trust it to fire, same as he didn't trust burning the whole ranch to chance either. Not till he was certain there wasn't some other copy floating around to bite him later." He spat into the dirt. "Paid me and my boys good money to make sure there wasn't." "Will you say that before Judge Price?" Wesley asked. "Sworn testimony in open court." Rourke looked at the rope Hank was already looping loose and ready over the fence rail, at the long ride to a Tucson jail cell that awaited him regardless of what he did next, and made the only calculation left available to a man in his position. "I'll say it," he muttered. "Man who'd let his own hired gun swing for his dirty work, same as he'd have burned a woman's home to the ground, don't deserve my silence." By dawn, with Rourke and his captured men bound and guarded in the depot's storeroom, awaiting the arrival of a deputy sheriff sent for from Calabasas, the first true snow of the season began to fall, soft and silent, dusting the golden cottonwood leaves in white and settling on the mountain shoulders that had worn autumn's colors so brilliantly only days before. Frances stood on the porch wrapped in a blanket, watching it fall, and felt Wesley come to stand beside her, his shoulder warm against hers. "We did it," she said, quiet with disbelief. "We actually did it. "We're not finished yet." He took her hand, lacing his fingers through hers the way he had that first night beneath the desert stars. "Corbin still holds the letter, and he'll not surrender it easy, not even with Rourke's confession waiting to be sworn." "No," Francis agreed. "But now we know exactly where to find it, and we have witnesses enough to make a judge listen when we go and take it from him." Deputy Sheriff Ira Nash arrived from Calabasas by midday, a lean, careful man who listened to Rourke's confession with a growing frown and took careful written statements from Francis, Wesley, Hank, and each of the Oadem riders and vaqueros who had helped defend the ranch. He examined the captured men's weapons, noted the tracks of the stampeded remuda, and by the time he had finished, his frown had settled into the grim satisfaction of a lawman who has finally found a case worth the writing. "I've had my suspicions of Silas Corbin a good while," Nash admitted, tucking his notebook away. "Man's grown richer these past 2 years than banking alone accounts for, and there's been talk of land he's acquired cheap through court proceedings that never quite sat right with folks who looked close. I'll take these men to Tucson myself, Miss Atwood, and I'll see Rourke's confession lodged with the court clerk before Judge Price ever takes the bench. You and Mr. Blackwell had best be there when court convenes." 5 days later, with the first real snow of the season lying thin but persistent across the Tucson streets, Frances Atwood walked into the crowded territorial courtroom with Wesley Blackwell at her side, Hank Dawson and Mr. Whitcomb close behind, and Doña Elena Ortega, who had made the long journey from Calabasas despite her age, leaning on Miguel's arm. Silas Corbin sat near the front of the courtroom in an expensive gray coat, his silver hair carefully combed, his expression one of wounded, patient dignity, as though he found the entire proceeding a distasteful imposition on his valuable time. He did not so much as glance at Frances as she took her seat, though she saw a muscle jump once in his jaw when Deputy Nash entered behind her, leading Cole Rourke, hands shackled, into the courtroom to sit in the row reserved for witnesses. Judge Harmon Price, a heavy-set man with a face weathered by 20 years of circuit riding across a rough territory, called the matter of the Atwood estate guardianship to order, and it was Whitcomb who spoke first, his nervous hands steady now with the courage of a debt finally being paid. "Your Honor, I must report an irregularity in the court's own filing," he said, and laid out, in careful detail, the recorded letter that had vanished from the file, the notation he had kept in his private register, and the strange appearance of a physician's affidavit that Dr. Fielding himself, called reluctantly to the stand under Nash's insistence, was forced to admit under oath he had never actually written, his signature having been forged from an old bank document Corbin had once had him sign for an entirely unrelated matter. Then came Doña Elena Ortega, her voice steady and unhurried despite her years, recounting word for word the contents of the stolen letter, Elias Atwood's plain, unwavering wish that his daughter inherit the line and the ranch outright, with no guardian appointed, along with his suspicion, written in his own hand, that Silas Corbin meant him harm should he refuse to name him executor. Finally, Cole Rourke, sullen but resigned, admitted before the packed courtroom that Silas Corbin had hired him and his men, first to intercept and destroy any letter contradicting the guardianship claim, and later to burn the Atwood ranch entirely rather than see the matter contested in open court. Silas Corbin's careful composure finally shattered. He rose from his seat, face flushed dark with fury. "This is a conspiracy of liars and criminals against an honest man's good name, Your Honor, I demand." "You will sit down, Mr. Corbin," Judge Price said, in a voice that filled the courtroom without needing to be raised, "or I will have you removed and this court will proceed to judgment without the benefit of your objections. I have heard sworn testimony of forgery, theft, attempted murder, and arson, all laid at your door by no fewer than 5 separate witnesses across 3 different frontier communities, along with a signed confession from your own hired man. I find the petition for guardianship of the Atwood estate to be founded entirely on fraud, and I dismiss it with prejudice. Full ownership of the Atwood stage and freight line, its equipment, contracts, and lands, is confirmed in Francis Atwood, sole heir of Elias Atwood, effective immediately. A murmur of satisfaction ran through the courtroom, and Frances felt tears she had been holding back for 7 long months finally spilled down her cheeks, Wesley's hand tightening warm around hers beneath the table. "As for you, Mr. Corbin," the judge continued, "I am ordering your immediate arrest on charges of fraud, forgery, and conspiracy to commit arson and assault, pending a full criminal trial before this same court. Deputy Nash, take him into custody." Corbin's face went the color of ash as Ira Nash stepped forward with shackles, and whatever dignity he had carried into the courtroom crumbled entirely as he was led out past the row of witnesses who had brought him down, unable even to meet Frances's eyes as he passed. The courtroom had not fully emptied, however, before a second matter was raised, this one quieter, spoken in a low aside between Judge Price and Deputy Nash that Frances only overheard because she and Wesley had not yet risen from their seats. "There is the matter of the man calling himself Wesley Blackwell," Nash said, not unkindly, producing a worn wanted notice from his coat, the ink faded but the name still legible. "Wesley Colton wanted in connection with the Silver City stage robbery, reward offered." Wesley rose slowly, his face pale but steady, and Frances rose with him, refusing to let him stand alone. "I am that man, Your Honor," he said, before anyone else could speak for him. "I won't deny it. I rode with the Colton gang 5 years back, was present at the Silver City robbery, and left that life the same night a man was shot who never should have been. I've spent every year since trying to live honestly under a name I chose to earn rather than one I was given by accident of birth." Judge Price studied him for a long moment, and then looked to Deputy Nash. "What do the records show as to injury or death in that robbery?" "One man wounded, Your Honor, a shotgun guard named Elijah Combs. He survived, walks with a limp to this day, according to the last report filed. No deaths were ever attributed to that robbery in any court record I've seen." "And this man's conduct since?" "I can speak to that myself, Your Honor," Frances said, before anyone could stop her, and the words poured out of her in a rush. "This man stepped down from a stagecoach into gunfire to defend a woman he had never met, when he might easily have stayed hidden and let the trouble pass him by. He helped uncover a fraud that would have stolen my inheritance and burned my home to ashes. 3 nights ago, he faced down armed men to defend my ranch, and took a hired outlaw captive alive rather than kill him, when killing would have been easier and safer for us both. If that is not the conduct of a reformed man, Your Honor, I do not know what conduct would satisfy the description." A murmur of agreement rose from Hank and Miguel, and even Doña Elena in the gallery, and Judge Price, who had ridden this rough circuit for 2 decades and seen every manner of man pass through his courtroom, regarded Wesley for a long, considering moment. 5 years is a long while to live an honest life under a borrowed name, Mr. Colton, or Mr. Blackwell, whichever you prefer to be called going forward. The judge tapped the faded wanted notice against his palm. "The victim of your old crime survived and was, according to this file, compensated some years back by an anonymous benefactor for his medical expenses and lost wages, a fact this court finds curious given the timing." His eyes glinted with something almost like humor beneath their weary weight. "I am inclined to believe that whatever debt was owed for that robbery has been substantially paid, in coin and in conduct both. This court will recommend to the territorial governor that the old warrant be set aside in light of restitution made and reform demonstrated, and further, that no further prosecution be pursued absent new evidence of wrongdoing. You would do well, sir, to make that restitution to Mr. Combs a matter of public record, should you wish this matter to remain settled." "I will do so gladly, Your Honor," Wesley said, his voice rough with an emotion he did not try to hide. "Thank you. Don't thank me. Thank the woman who spoke for you, and thank whatever conscience made a former outlaw step down into another man's gunfight for strangers." Judge Price banged his gavel once, final. "This court is adjourned." Outside on the courthouse steps, snow still falling soft and light over the streets of Tucson, Frances turned to find Wesley watching her with an expression she had not yet seen on his face, something unguarded and full and almost disbelieving. "You didn't have to do that," he said. "Speak for me like that in front of the whole town. You didn't have to walk into gunfire for a stranger at Paloma Springs," she said, echoing words she had spoken to him what felt like a lifetime ago now. "I find I've developed a habit of matching you, Mr. Blackwell." He laughed, a real laugh, bright and unguarded, and pulled her into his arms right there on the courthouse steps, snow settling on both their shoulders, and kissed her again, slower this time, surer, a kiss with no fear left folded inside it. "I believe I'm in love with you, Frances Atwood," he said against her hair. "I believe I have been since the moment you told 8 armed men this was your land and to turn around. I believe I fell in love with you somewhere between the first bullet and the last," she said, laughing through tears that were, for the first time in 7 long months, entirely happy ones. "Though I confess the bullwhip helped." They returned to Paloma Springs a week later, the mountains behind them now properly winter-white, the valley floor still holding to the last brave gold of autumn cottonwoods, and the depot yard, when they arrived, was full of familiar faces. Hank Dawson standing proud on the porch, Tomas Reyes fully healed and grinning, Senora Delgado already setting out a celebratory supper, and word sent ahead to Luis Manuel's family and Doña Elena Ortega, both of whom promised to make the journey for what Frances had, somewhat shyly, begun calling a wedding rather than merely a courtship. They were married 3 weeks later in the depot yard itself, beneath a clear December sky, with Hank standing as witness for Frances and Tomas standing for Wesley, and Doña Elena Ortega weeping happy tears through the whole ceremony, and Luis Manuel's family bringing gifts of woven baskets and dried corn as blessing for the new household. The circuit preacher, passing through on his own regular route, agreed to perform the ceremony a full day earlier than planned once he heard the whole remarkable story, declaring he had rarely officiated a match he felt more certain about. In the spring that followed, once the mountain snows had melted and the first green returned to the Santa Cruz Valley, Frances and Wesley repainted the sign above the depot door, so that it no longer read simply the Atwood Stage and Freight Line, but the Atwood and Blackwell Stage and Freight Line. Their names joined the way their lives now were, in partnership rather than rescue, in choice rather than chance. Wesley took over much of the driving and the horse breeding, his steady hands and calm nerve making him as fine a whip as any driver the line had ever employed, while Frances managed the ledgers and the contracts, and the delicate diplomacy of relations with Sonoran traders and Tohono O'odham families alike, precisely as her father had taught her. Hank stayed on as foreman until his knees finally forced him into a well-earned retirement in a small house behind the depot, where he could still watch the coaches come and go each week and offer unsolicited advice to anyone who would listen. Tomas Reyes, fully grown into his courage after the night he had ridden in wounded to deliver half a warning, took over as lead outrider on the Calabasas run, proud as any young man could be. On the evening of their first anniversary, Frances and Wesley stood together on the depot porch, watching the last stage of the day roll in from Tucson beneath a sky just beginning to gold at the edges with sunset, the mountains behind wearing early autumn color once again, brilliant and unhurried, hiding, as they always did in that country, whatever weather might yet be coming. "Any regrets, Mr. Blackwell?" Frances asked, leaning into his side as his arms settled naturally around her shoulders. "Only one," he said, pretending to consider it seriously. "I do regret that I very nearly let that first stage carry me straight on through to Calabasas without stopping. You'd have missed quite a bit of trouble." "I'd have missed you," he said simply, and kissed the top of her head as the incoming coach rattled to a stop in the yard below, passengers climbing down into a place that had become, against every hard beginning, exactly the home they had both chosen to build together. And there was never any road worth taking, once I understood that. The stage line ran on, as it always had, promises kept on a schedule through fair weather and foul. But now it ran under two names instead of one, and neither of them, not for a single mile of that beautiful, dangerous, golden country, ever intended to simply pass through again.